I just attended what was for me a really positive and inspirational lecture by this guy right here, Calvin Neufeld, dealing with trans activism, veganism, and some related and unrelated questions. For me, the most interesting thing to really look at are the nature and objectives of the trans movement. What finally is the objective this is moving towards in our society? And that is by no means a simple, settled question that all trans activists would agree on. Yeah, I think it's fair to say. Right. What finally is the objective for the society you're looking towards? So I really used this very evocative image during your lecture of a stack of turtles, and where the turtle at the bottom is fundamentally objecting to the hierarchy. And the question I put to you is, well, how radical is the final end state trans activism? How different is it from the world we live in today, given that we do have a few positive examples of societies on Earth where, I do think at least transgender people are accepted. It may not be paradise, may not be absolutely perfect, but how different is the end goal trans activists are working towards in a country like Canada compared to countries like Thailand, Laos, Cambodia that seem to me several steps ahead?
How radical is it to normalize human diversity?
Right.
To me, that's not radical at all.
Right.
It's just radical because it's not necessarily the norm. People who are different are often sort of kept out of the public eye or
Right.
seen as being less than others. And I think we're past that point of seeing people with differences as being inferior or not the same. We are all the same. So I really see one of the many goals of trans activism being to just equalize all of us, humans and non-human animals, and just recognize the value of life in all of its forms and all of its expressions.
So one of the subtle aspects of your lecture, this is in the lecture itself and also in Q&A, was that you see it as quite positive to regard transgender people as a third gender rather than absolutely being the gender they identify with today. So I just said I myself have talked to transgender people at different points on, I guess, the political spectrum. It seems to me that's not a simple or settled point. So this conversation is happening in Canada, by the way, where there is, and you mentioned it, there is a special kind of influence of the First Nations tradition here, the idea of a third gender and that being positive. I really liked him related to positive. He said during the lecture, transgender people have a unique kind of privilege and positive contribution to our culture to make because they're in the position of having grown up female and then at some point switched to living as a male or having grown up male, and that's a perspective that has some value. I relate to that really positively. I think, okay, great. That's something where, within the diversity of society, even if you regard it as eccentric, which may well be, I'm vegan, I'm in many ways an eccentric, you know what I mean? It's something that, we talk about normalizing it, but it's also something special. It's something extraordinary. It's a perspective that contribute positively with all its eccentricities, rolled up in it. Do you feel, or do other trans activists sometimes confront you or disagree with you, where they say no, there isn't a third gender, like there's only two genders and they're just born the wrong gender, whatever? Is that a conflict in the movement?
I wouldn't say that all trans people belong to this third gender category. I wouldn't say that. Some cultures recognize a distinct third gender, and it's been part of a long centuries or millennia long tradition, just recognizing the diversity. But gender is a spectrum. So there are plenty of trans people who are, let's say, all the way on one end of a gender spectrum or all the way on the other end of the gender spectrum. Same with non-trans people. You can be hyper male or hyper female, or you can be anywhere in between.
Right.
So for me, for example, on that spectrum, I would place myself on the male side of middle.
Right.
I'm not on one extreme or on another extreme. And how trans people identify, there's absolutely no universal way to describe it. There are as many ways of being trans as there are trans people. But it's lovely to see how different societies and cultures have recognized the kind of diversity that occurs within every human population, and just exploring that and not being threatened by terminology so much. People are very, very sensitive about labels and terms, and I just see it all as many different ways of describing human experience.
Another kind of subtle question that was on my mind while I was listening to the lecture is a kind of tension between normalization and radicalization. So the lecture dealt with veganism, animal rights, and so on, and also actually prison politics as well as transgenders. It's a weird contradictory situation where I kind of agree with both. On the one hand, okay, yes, you want to normalize the position of transgender people in society, but there's also a call here to radicalize the role of transgender people in transforming society. So I don't know if you want to just comment on that. It's kind of simultaneously both at the same time. It's completely normal. It's completely not extraordinary. And also, hey, this is an extraordinary opportunity to transform society and challenge norms. Yeah.
You know, one of the things that I absolutely love about being trans is that the minute somebody knows that you're trans, they don't know what to think about anything anymore. Right? It throws you off.
Right.
And so all of your assumptions, we are constantly imposing assumptions on everybody we meet.
Right.
So the minute somebody has that blank, I don't know what to think right now, that's when a real conversation can begin. And that's that radical approach that we can take to everything. You know, we've talked, somebody after my talk today, he's a cisgender, non-trans, tall, good-looking white man. And he says it's hard for me to talk about some of these things and the interconnectedness of oppression, for example, because people say, oh, you're just a privileged white man. What do you know? And I said, but somebody like me, I can say it because nobody knows what to think about anything. And I can say there's femininity in me without thinking that that makes me less of a guy. Or we can compare human and animal suffering without humans getting all defensive saying, what, you're comparing me to an animal that's inferior to me? It's hard for a cisgender privileged white man to make those comparisons.
Right.
But someone like me, I'm free because nobody knows what to think about anything anymore. And I just love being in that position where I can just turn things upside down and have people just listen with an open mind and an open heart.
Right. So I'm going to tell a really brief anecdote that I think for me illustrates all the points that were in the lecture and the questions I'm asking now. Because to me, these are just broad questions about the final destination for transgender activism. When I was living in Thailand and Laos, so it was back and forth across the border, so I was living in both places, I was out doing research, I was out doing humanitarian work, I wasn't living there as a tourist. But you know, I encountered a group of high school students who were out on a camping trip, and one of them was transgender. And the other high school students treated her, so as a male to female transgender person, completely normally. Like, it was absolutely no awkwardness or stiffness. Like, not even, if you can cast your mind back, I'm 40 years old. I can remember a time when in a lot of situations, like, oh, there's a black person coming to dinner. And there's just a little bit of special decorum or something. People stiffen up a little bit or a little bit more formal. There was absolutely none of that. You know, like one of the cis hetero teenagers was tuning his guitar, and the transgender teenager came and was like, no, you're doing it wrong. And everything about this scenario where, you know, you could see they don't care. It actually doesn't matter. This is, so in a positive sense, this is indifference. It's an indifference of inclusion, not an indifference of oppression or exclusion.
That's the normalization. That's the normalization.
Right.
You know, before, when I was female-bodied, when I looked like a girl and people treated me like a girl, nothing made sense.
Right.
Nothing made sense to me.
Right.
And honestly, even if people were uncomfortable with being lesbian, gay, bi, or trans and stuff like that, I didn't really make sense to them either. So even people who had a hard time accepting me as trans when I came out, once that initial confusion and shock wore off, all of a sudden they realized, actually a lot of things make sense now.
Right.
Our gender is not our body. Our gender is in our mind. So they say, you know, gender's in between your ears and your sex is between your legs. So there's a difference between your sex and your gender. So your biological sex versus your sense of your own self as male or female. And, you know, what makes somebody male or female is a whole complex set of factors. And a lot of the time when somebody finally comes out as trans and says, this is who I am, and if you're willing to not have a fear-based response to that, you're going to realize it all makes sense. I am a guy.
Right.
Just like that person with those teenagers was a girl.
Right.
Regardless of what sex they were assigned at birth.
Right.
And so as long as we're open to that and not have a fear-based phobic response to people, we realize that this is their truth and it just makes sense. And, you know, you're hanging out with a guy right now just like those people were hanging out with a girl.
And I'm terrified. Look, you know, so some people, all right, I have maybe 2,000 regular viewers. I would say 5 of them are trans people, to my knowledge. Maybe a lot of you are and you haven't admitted to me. But about 5 people. And the last time I talked about transgender politics, I would say 1 out of 5 really reacted negatively. Maybe 3 or 4 wrote to me positively and said they see where I was coming from. And, you know, some people react to what I just phrased about indifference. They actually regard that as transphobic. You know what I mean? Now, okay, interesting point. So currently in Thailand, there are some transgender politicians. They run in elections. The last elections, there were several that were talked about. they probably have a slight disadvantage in elections. There's probably just a question of like, okay, well, what was your career? What did you really do with your life? There's maybe a little bit more scrutiny, but they're not they're not disqualified, or they're not regarded as a laughingstock in that society. And by contrast, I'd say, by the way, in Italy, it is very, very hard. There have been some transgender politicians, but it's really kind of a freak show for the press. It reacts in a very different way. But I don't see the end goal of transgender activism as being heterosexual society being ruled by transgender people or something. I totally see it. Okay, however many, we could have a transgender prime minister, or as it happens, but I don't think they'd be elected for that reason and so on. So again, I'm sorry, that's really all I have to say on the topic. But it's obviously I can understand it's difficult to see a word like indifference as a positive value. But if you look over the border from Thailand to Malaysia, or Thailand to Indonesia, to Muslim majority countries, you'd be like, wow, what an amazing accomplishment it would be if transgender people or homosexual people could be regarded with indifference. It'd be an unbelievable step forward for the society.
Absolutely, and I think we're well on our way.
Yeah.
And I think indifference is wonderful, wonderful. I keep telling people it's no big whoop.
Right.
And it's a naturally occurring, morally benign phenomenon. It just has always existed, and we're just coming to recognize it more today because we live in a world where it's we can express our truths a bit more, and we're heading in the right direction. But it's simply no big whoop. And honestly, like I've been 12 years ago I transitioned. So
right.
12 years ago. At first it was big. It was huge. Most people had never met a trans person in their life, or at least...
Or they didn't know they had.
They didn't know they had. Exactly. And so that was kind of like, part of me was like, oh, that's kind of neat, because it's neat to see people's surprise and
right.
that kind of reaction. Sometimes not always in a good way, but at the same time, the novelty of it was kind of interesting to observe. Today...
Right.
It's nothing, and it's always like, man,
right. And this
it's
is
nothing now.
And this is within one lifetime. It's a huge change.
Within a decade,
sure.
everything has changed, and you tell someone you're trans now, and they say, okay.
Right.
And that is progress, because it never was anything big. It never was anything shocking.
So I think to end this interview, then I'm going to ask you to contrast that to veganism. I mean, they're totally different in so many ways. Don't get me wrong, but obviously he discussed also the ways in which, for him, these are intersecting and overlapping, interests or movements or what have you. One of the things that occurred to me while I was listening to your lecture is, you know what? Nobody really enjoys oppressing trans people. And this says, to extend it also to gays and bisexuals and lesbians, most people don't really enjoy being homophobic or hating or oppressing. And one of the stark contrasts is people really enjoy eating meat or eating cheese or dairy products or eggs. So, I mean, now look, some people are so warped with religion, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam primarily, that they are highly motivated to be transphobic or homophobic. Yeah. So there's some kind, but to me, I mean, that really seemed a very strange thing where the pleasure principle, if you want, is really fundamentally against veganism. It's this huge obstacle. Whereas I think it's, I would think it's not with transphobia or with trans activism.
Well,
take that any direction.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, let's look at it from the trans angle. When I came out, I come from a conservative Christian family, and but very loving, compassionate, intelligent parents, and at first they didn't know what to think of it. They didn't know how to fit it into all of everything that they'd ever believed and their belief structures. And today, my mother, in her, they were never anything but loving and supportive, but they couldn't be as celebratory of who I was as they would have liked to have been. And today, she experiences a certain degree of grief over that, and she thinks, if only right. I had known.
Right.
And you know what? She also wrote the book Suffering Eyes, A Chronicle of Awakening,
right.
about her awakening to the suffering of animals. And the response to that is, if only I had known sooner. I spent 49 years of my life
right.
not understanding
right.
how I was contributing to such enormous suffering in this world. People who have had their eyes opened to the suffering of animals, and people who have had their eyes opened to the diverse human diversity and the
right.
suffering of our fellow humans, would never go back.
Right.
So anybody who thinks, no, this is what I like, this I'm just going to stick as a meter and I'm going to stick as a transphobic or a homophobic person, and they think that that is their comfort zone, they have no idea what they're missing, and they have no idea how they're going to regret that once they open their eyes and their hearts, and how they would never go back to that position that they thought they would never leave.
Okay, but overall, thank you. I mean, look, you guys know I'm cynical as hell. This is one of the only people I've met who has a degree in philosophy that's putting it to good use. It was a genuinely uplifting and genuinely inspirational lecture. Unfortunately, it makes me want to go back into prison activism. I was involved in prison activism in the past. Yeah, I mean...
evolve our prison farms.
Here's the sense in which I'm jealous. I think trans rights, transsexual activism, I think it's going to achieve all its goals within 50 years, except Saudi Arabia, except a few places like that. And, veganism, I think it's going to be 500 years. Okay, thank you very much for appearing on the show.
Thanks,
Calvin Newman, I'll give links to his
Calvin
book.
Neufeld.
So, Calvin Neufeld, I'm going to provide links to his book and his related websites in the description. This is a brief follow-up recorded right after the interview, a few meters away with a slightly different view of the park in the background. Very often, right when you hit the stop button on a discussion like that, you have a little bit more chit-chat back and forth that clarifies and would clarify for the audience what the purpose of the conversation was all about. So what you guys didn't hear is that before that conversation, he used this very evocative image that I challenged him on. He repeatedly said in his lecture, he talked about hierarchy and oppression in society as being like a stack of turtles. And then the turtle at the bottom manages to bring the whole stack down, and then all the turtles are equal, lying in a pond together. And the reason why I challenged him with these examples of Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand was that it seems to me, very fundamentally, that the objectives of trans activism, and you could also say gay rights activism, you could include them in one category here, both movements, they are not, in this sense, radical, revolutionary, anti-hierarchical, they're not anarchist. I was asking him to consider, well, in a country like Thailand, or even a country like Cambodia, you still literally have a king, along with all the other elements of hierarchy. So isn't it rather the case that the objectives of the trans movement, trans rights movement, wouldn't you say that these objectives really can be accomplished without this fundamental challenge to hierarchy in society? Then he gave a very interesting answer during the lecture, and then we continued this conversation afterwards, recorded and shared it with you guys. What I said just now when I hit the stop button was, look, in a country like Canada, it's very easy for me to imagine that the trans movement will have accomplished all of its goals within 50 years. And then at that point, it can start to become invisible. And he agreed with me. He said, yeah, it's very easy. He was talking to me about just how much progress had happened in the last 10 years, and he really feels that the goals of that movement are finite and attainable within the society we already have. Again, it doesn't require tearing down the society we're currently living in, not in Canada. Now, there was an interesting footnote where I said, well, obviously in Saudi Arabia, very different situation. In Saudi Arabia, how much really will change within 50 years and how much will change within 200 years, it's really worth talking about as a separate topic. I said, my profound apprehension about this issue is as follows. I currently live in a small town in Taiwan where there are many, many vegan restaurants within a short walk of me. I think there are about 50 vegan restaurants in the city as a whole. And it's not enough for me that when I walk out my door, there are 4 different vegan restaurants within a city block, let's say, okay? That there are 4 vegan restaurants I could walk past on my way to the grocery store, depending. I'd have to take a bit of a zigzag route, honestly, to cross all 4, but there are several vegan restaurants right around my home, and then probably about 30 in the downtown core area, 50 in the city as a whole. It's not enough. On a fundamental level, my problem is that when I walk past one of those vegan restaurants, right next to it, there's a meat market which is hanging the corpses of chickens with their skulls crushed in. They crush the skulls there with like a metal peg, it looks like, caved in skulls. There are, dismembered corpses of pigs hanging. Often the pig's face, the pig's skull, the whole leg is hanging there. With gay rights, it's enough if there were just a couple of gay nightclubs in the whole city. Gay rights is not trying to close down heterosexual nightclubs. You see, it will never be enough for veganism to merely open a few more vegan restaurants. The objective of our form of activism ultimately is to close down the slaughterhouses, is to close down the restaurants and the markets that are serving meat. So, you know, it's a huge problem that in many religious societies, transgender people can't open a single nightclub. If they try to open a nightclub, it has to be underground or covert, and it's, you know, harassed by the police, what have you. And people, if they go to that nightclub, then their boss at work finds out and they're fired for just going to this. That kind of thing is common. It was much more common 50 years ago, but in religious and conservative societies, this is still an issue to this day. So the goals of the transgender movement, they might be satisfied if in the whole city there were 1 or 2 or 5 transgender nightclubs. They just want to be tolerated and not oppressed, for this to be normal, etc., etc. These are easily attainable within 50 years, at least in secular democratic societies. But the goals of veganism are fundamentally much more uncompromising. And the type of accepting indifference that I talked about repeatedly during that interview, where I say, okay, transgender people can be indifferent to transgender people, and that acceptance itself is a victory. That could be a positive conclusion to the transgender movement, whereas it would mean total defeat and dissolution for the vegan movement. What veganism is trying to accomplish, we can't get there just through other people being indifferent to us or tolerating us or being accepting of us in the way that already the society is accepting of people who are lactose intolerant, people who have food allergies, or people who have religious-based diets, who put themselves in a minority. All those people are tolerated. But I mean, the purpose of the kosher diet within Judaism is not to transform all of society into being kosher. And the purpose of veganism, and let's face it, the purpose of the transgender movement is not, it's definitely not to transform everyone into being transgender. But the purpose of veganism, the end goal veganism is working towards, it's very profoundly and fundamentally different. Because we won't be satisfied until the slaughterhouses are closed down.